Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Arden, and today we're talking about, let's see, Dark Knight's Death Metal Legends of the Dark Knights #1. I laughed because I had to look at the cover just to successfully say that whole title. But this is an anthology book going over various origins of some of the new Dark Knight's death metal characters that we've seen so far in the event. And it's got a hell of a roster in terms of creators and names on the cover of this thing. Of course, there's like Scott Snyder and other current DC writers like Tinian the Fourth, Williamson, Tomasi, but also some older names like that are cool to see on here, like Marguerite Bennett, Thierry Ennis, Tony S. Daniel, Jamal Ingle, and a couple of others that we'll get into as we go along. So I was pretty excited about this book. And at $5.99, it's fair to expect a little bit of a longer book. Um, so with that in mind, let's kind of go through each of the individual stories and what I thought of them, and then I'll sort of give my overall review. I will say, maybe for those that want to avoid spoilers, while this very much bolsters a huge roster of writers and artists who are cool to see writing this kind of content, a lot of focus is spent on the Darkest Night, or the Batman Who Laughs, his brain being transplanted into Dr. Manhattan. That's almost half the book. Another huge chunk is dedicated to the Robin King, and everything else is like only a couple of pages long in terms of a story featuring all the other cool characters, which is a bit of a point of contention for me and does kind of unravel any sense of like me really liking this book to a degree. I'll talk about each of the stories, but as I do, I will get into spoilers a bit. So if you are interested in seeing this or like reading this spoiler free, we'll just leave it at a recommendation. But well, not even a recommendation. It's probably worth skipping this, even though I do like the rest of Dark Knights. Um, if you really are interested in some of these characters, this book will get into it a little bit, but I am warning you, it's very small in its scope and scale beyond its initial first two stories. But with all that in mind, the first story is by far the longest, featuring the Darkest Night in a story called I Am Here, with three writers behind it: Scott Snyder, James Tynion IV, and Joshua Williamson. Tony S. Daniel doing the artwork, Marcelo Maiolo doing coloring, and Tom Napolitano doing lettering. Now, overall, the art team is so good in this book and so on point in a story that spans the history of the Batman Who Laughs and talks about his origins a little bit again, but also it digs into the origins of Batman by proxy. So we get a lot of cool shots of all sorts of Batman imagery, uh, starting off with pretty typical stuff and then getting very dark very quickly as he becomes the Batman Who Laughs, and we get into the events of the first DC Metal event, all of which is summarized quite well and done in a pretty awesome way on the whole. If you don't know a lot about metal or something like that, this is a cool book to show to people in something along those lines. And now that I'm even saying that out loud, it's probably a good one to share with my friends who I've been a little slow to share death metal content with because it's a little confusing. Then it gets into the events of death metal and stuff leading up to it, as well as the origins of the Batman who apparently became Dr. Manhattan that we saw as part of the death metal storyline. And that's really cool to see. It gets into his origins, and he goes into this vault like experiment trying to replicate the energies he found off of the button, and basically replicates the conditions that created Dr. Manhattan and becomes that himself. But the Batman Who Laughs is waiting for him and just lobotomized the guy so that he was just inert until the Batman Who Laughs brain could be transplanted into him. And then a lot of this book is also dedicated to describing the mental transformation of the Batman Who Laughs into the Darkest Night and how he's different, why he's different, which makes sense given Dr. Manhattan's huge, enormous scope of powers. And then he kind of goes over his plans to basically create his own multiverse called the Multiverse Who Laughs and use it as a sort of belt of ammunition against Perpetua and any other gods along her similar level of power that might get in his way until he could just overwhelm all existence in the entire omniverse, and he will be like the one singular being that exists across all of it. Um, and that's how the book pretty much ends. Now, what I'm describing is awesome. I would say like 90% of it is really great, and it is a huge chunk of the book, like I kind of gave a little warning of at the beginning. It opens and closes with various Alfreds doing the operation, and the Darkest Knight knows the questions the Alfreds are going to ask him before they even ask it, which is a beautiful illustration of his new level of power and the scope of his abilities. I don't know how the superheroes are supposed to take him on. I really think it just comes down to those other gods that originally imprisoned Perpetua coming in and cleaning house or something, because how is Wonder Woman supposed to elevate to that? I don't know. That story all does a really good job of escalating things. Where it loses me is at one point, like we go back to the origins of Batman on this page. And by the way, like really cool imagery permeates throughout this, like I was talking about earlier, but also the lettering's really cool. And it varies from character to character, reflecting different tones and stuff. But mostly it's focused on the Batman Who Laughs frantic narration, but that changes when he starts to talk as Dr. Manhattan and then becomes the Darkest Knight, or like Batman Manhattan, or whatever it's called. But at one point he says, "Understanding this, I know that I am not Batman of any kind. Not a Batman Who Laughs, not a Batman Manhattan, not even a culmination of all dark Batman. I am more, and to be more, I must not be a reaction. I must be the thing that creates the reaction. I will be the bullet. The multiverse will be the dark alley, and the worlds will fall like pearls before me." And this is where the story loses me. And I try not to let like this one page of like just the most ham-fisted writing I've ever stumbled across. Well, okay, not ever, but in some time. It's just so on the nose and goofy. And I said literally in my last review of Batman number 96 that I was getting real tired of content featuring the origins of Batman. And I had already read this with this in mind, because I didn't mind it when it was at first and it was getting into like not just, the origins of Batman, but his time training and meeting villains and allies throughout his history. I was down for all of that. But when we started getting into this weird stuff, or like not even weird, it's like passé, easily done before. Braddock is saying, "How's it going? Heard about the latest Suicide Squad game news?" I have not. But that doesn't stop me from looking it up right now. So, Suicide Squad game, huh? I haven't heard anything about that, so I'm curious. It might explain a question another friend asked me today about the Avengers game coming out, and if I thought it would be any good. And I was like, I don't really know, but the last game I played from Square, which is Final Fantasy 15, it's pretty fun. I actually talked about that recently on another stream. Game? Yes, to say. Whoa! Batman Arkham maker Rocksteady is confirmed a Suicide Squad game. Well, that's even cooler than my whole top 10 prediction video I made, and way more ambitious. Well, that's great news. I'm all for that, and that should be a bit of interesting gameplay. Maybe I can make a video about that. Anyways, so aside from like a real weak point in terms of that like one page I was talking about, the rest of it's pretty cool and establishes a lot going on in the Dark Knights, and even going over it live on stream now, I've come to appreciate that one a little bit more, and it eases some of the concerns I have with this book a little later on. Yeah, and still, I'm debating whether or not we should just do a whole other video on that Suicide Squad news. That feels like a big deal. But we'll see. So, next up is a story about the Robin King. This is by Peter J. Tomasi, who did story and words as he's credited. Riley Rossmo did the artwork. He's always so awesome and does a lot of really great Batman content. And this is right along the lines of the work he did in that Batman Shadow crossover. Ivan Placencia is the colorist, also a great colorist. Also works well with Riley Rossmo. Rob Lee's the letterer. Again, it's a familiar name, and who also did a great job. The thing that really blew me away about this one is I had thought, and maybe misread, or just assumed along with everyone else, that the Robin King was some version of Damian Wayne. Not so. It's a child psychotic version of Bruce Wayne, and this story is all about like Alfred raising this child and coming to terms with that, gradually realizing that Bruce Wayne is a monster that he has to stop, only for it to be too late. And we get the origins of the Robin King. And straight up, I think this is my favorite part of this whole book. Peter Tomasi is once again still like my favorite current Batman writer, and just really consistent in a lot of the work that he does. I don't have a lot against Tinian the Fourth, but Tomasi is the one that just always brings this interesting take on things with his writing and the ideas he comes up with. That paired with Riley Rossmo and Placencia's artwork, and it's a solid book, or like story within this book. Almost worth the price of admission alone. But then we get into where the book starts to lose me. We have Batman Source Rex, a story by Marguerite Bennett, with art by Jamal Ingle. Chris Sotomayor does the artwork, and Dave Sharp does lettering. A solid cast of people, if there ever was one. And such a cool idea for them to do a story. It's 2 pages long, and there really isn't anything to it. It gives a little bit of a sense of where the Batman T-Rex came from, but I am not won over by that story at all, because it's just so short, and I was like, oh, that's crushing, and a little bit of a forbearance of what's to come. But next up is a longer story, and one that is also really good. It's called This Man, This City. It's written by Frank Thierry, with Francesco Francavilla doing the art and coloring, and Endworld Design doing lettering. And holy crap, is this a good book. This is about the origins of the Batman City, or like the Bat Castle, he's called in Death Metal. And it tells of how like this elderly Batman tried to pass the mantle down to Damian Wayne, but Damian just couldn't live up to it. And as Gotham kind of descended into chaos, Batman, like Bruce Wayne, performs this blood ritual where he sacrifices his son to become Gotham City itself and just becomes this living city. Frank Thierry does such a good job with this, and I like think of him more as an artist. I don't know if I'm wrong to do that. Let me just double check I'm not getting him. I am getting him confused with someone else. But he is like more of a classic writer. I tend to think of him. Looking over his writing, it really goes into the 2000s, but I have a lot of solid memories of him, even if I just confused him with Quietly for a second. He did such a great job with this, and Frank Villa's artwork is really nice, too. It's very, I don't know, elegant in its design. That's the right word for it. There's a lot going on with just a relatively short amount of pages, but it's much more substantial than like the Bat Tomasi work. Praddock was saying he agrees about Tomasi. His stories are grounded and family focused. They make you feel good, even when they're about dark stuff. I agree. They feel powerful and have a certain sense to them. After that is another 2-page story called Road Warrior by Daniel Warren Johnson, who does words and art. Mike Spicer, who did the coloring. Russ Wooton, who does lettering. And again, it's the same problem as the Bat T-Rex book. It's kind of cool. It's got some interesting imagery that, for a hot second, reminded me of the Animatrix story, where it depicts how humanity fell to the machine race. But that only goes on for like 2 pages, a panel within the 2 pages, and then it has flashes of Mad Max even. But again, that's just a panel in 2 pages. And this is kind of where I have a bit of a problem with the story, because after that, we have just 2 more pages. It's a story called I Shall Become by Garth Innes, Joel Jones doing the artwork, Jordi Belair doing the coloring, and Rob Steen doing the lettering. Depending on how much you know about those names, don't get too excited, because it really is just a Batman. It's funny, it's funny too, because Garth Ennis wrote this. Like, it's not what I predicted out of him at all, and it's good because like it's unpredictable like that. And out of all the 2 pages stories, it's certainly the one I got the most out of. But it's this body, or it's this Batman whose body died, and he transfers his body into a new clone, but something goes wrong, and he's born as a baby, and he like describes how he's like, oh, like crawling, like he goes over his roster of abilities. He's like crawling, gurgling, soft spot on my skull where a foe could potentially poke a finger into my brain, incontinence. But then he goes over his ultimate weapon, and he just starts crying. It's like, well, no one's no one can ignore a crying baby going on forever and ever. So there's a certain sense of, I don't know. Like I said, out of the 2 pages, that's the one I got the most out of, because at least it made me laugh a couple of times, and it had a little something to it. Out of all the ones, it felt the most appropriate for being only 2 pages long. I will answer answer your question in a second, Praddock, because it's a good one. But I do want to say overall, you can't tell, I really like the first 2 stories in spite of some misgivings, especially because like that's some very lame writing to come out of 3 major DC writers. I don't know how no one thought like, hey, this is really lame. This 1 page here where like he's, I don't know, that's just so tacky. Describing like, oh, I'm the Bullet, and the multiverse is the dark alley, and we're gonna like the worlds will fall into it like a string of pearls. Like, I get what they're going for, but could you be more Zack Snyder in that moment? But aside from that, it's really cool and very sort of big in its ambitions in terms of what it's doing with the whole Manhattan content. Out of all the stuff with like DC going full Watchmen, this stuff is at least the most interesting and ambitious. And it's really like, well, Dr. Manhattan, for all his power, was a very ambivalent and passive character. What's his power like when he's very active and aggressive, like the Batman Who Laughs? I am curious about that, and that has piqued my interest through this book, which helps me kind of buoy against some of my ongoing, I don't know, growing misgivings about the Dark Knights potentially just falling flat, like some of these other events we're talking about, like the Joker War and Empire, which touches on what you said, Praddock, but I'm not there yet. Robin King, by far the strongest book out of here, and like I said, almost worth the price of admission on its own. But then the rest of the book kind of felt like a few disappointments, buoyed up by that Batman City story, which is quite strong. I wish that they just let those other 2 pagers with the Batman T-Rex and the Batman monster truck breathe a little bit, because they had some real potential there and really felt like they could have been a book on its own. And I don't want to police DC too much, and I never would really. It feels wrong to be like, oh, there should be more tie-ins coming out of a book, but after reading this, I kind of wish there was more out of it or something, because it felt a little weak. If this book was cheaper and there was less of it, I guess, or something, it would be a lot easier to justify. If it was bigger and correspondingly more expensive, it might be a lot easier for me to justify. And I think that's the direction this book should have gone, given the huge number of talented names on here. However, I am not an editor, and I really don't see the business side of things on DC's end. And it might be, economically or whatever, this was the best case scenario, in which case I feel like this book is a little too overweight with people or something, because it just doesn't work, and something should have been different. I acknowledge I don't really see the business side of things. I really don't know what would have been best for all of this, but this book has too many ideas that I wish were more explored. The Watchmen story, I think, needed to have been more fleshed out. Something was missing here, and I don't think I recommend it, like I said earlier on at the beginning of this review. Now, Pradek asked a really good question, but I kind of wanted to get that part out before I got to it. He said, how would you compare Empire against Dark Knight's death metal? Which one has been strong? I'm also going to throw Joker War in here because I would say those are the three current like big Marvel DC events right now. Out of the three, from what I've seen so far, and to be fair, at the rate they're going, they're all pretty much at the same midpoint now. I think the Joker War's got the most to go still, but only by one issue. Um, so, out of the three, I think what I've seen out of the Joker War is kind of the weakest, but I came into that one. No, I'm wrong. The weakest one right now is Empire because we're really far into it. I haven't reviewed issue number 4 yet, but I have read it, and this does inform my opinion of what I'm saying right now. But Empire is definitely the weakest. It's got some fairly lackluster tie-ins, a couple of really good tie-ins, and that's about it. It's not really going anywhere, and the plant alien invasion thing feels very limited in what it's going to offer going forward, to the extent that I wouldn't recommend that event at all. The Joker War, I certainly had a lot of problems with the most recent issue, and I wasn't even that interested going in. But it's got a lot more going for it than Empire, and certainly even out of the first book, there's been more substance coming out of it. And even by process of introducing a character like Punchline and showing like survivalist Harley Quinn along with Clown Hunter, it's introducing things, so it's got more going for it in that regard. So clearly, by process of elimination, I'm going to say death metal so far is at the top. I'm increasingly growing concerned death metal will kind of fall flat and not really amount to much of anything. And this tie-in didn't really help my opinion of anything because I found it relatively weak. But it's got a lot of creativity going for it, and even some of the cool ideas we've gotten so far out of death metal are enough that it's still above all of this stuff. Because, if you're going to introduce Wonder Woman forging her jet into an invisible chainsaw, if I read all that right, the Batman using a black power ring, all of these cool characters, even if their backstory tie-in book wasn't that strong, it's pretty cool overall. Braddock was saying, I'm surprised Dark Knights doesn't have any tie-ins. It seems pretty self-contained. It's got a few standalone issues, but otherwise, yeah, it seems pretty self-contained. That's surprising. It feels like the kind of thing that should be like a Secret Wars style event, but maybe DC didn't think that was for the best, and maybe given COVID, that was for the best. I think death metal really was supposed to just be a little side series, and even what we're getting out of these tie-ins is like expanded, grown content. And maybe that explains why this book felt a little rough around the edges. In fact, I think that explains it quite a bit. Paddock was saying, Justice League just completed its ongoing arc in issue number 50. I have been following your Justice League review from 47 or 48. Would love to hear what you think of issue number 50. Well, I've read number 50, but that's last in line. I always do whatever I have to pull out of the week in random order. I don't know, I just think it's most fun that way. I used to rate them by like quality to a certain degree. I came away from that because I don't know, there was a million problems cropping out of it, and it was more fun just to be like, oh, like let's just do this in a random way. It also helped the indie books a little bit, kind of move to the front a little more often, and or like not be front loaded, because if I was rating them by quality, they might go first, and they were getting crowded out because of that too. So this way, just it's most fair if they're all just done in random order. I have a lot of thoughts about number 50, but I will say I quite enjoyed it on the whole. To an extent that I was almost surprised. But maybe it's also worth pointing out, and I was thinking about this before I started my review. We are reviewing 3 books featuring Batman to various degrees this week. The first was Batman number 96. The second was this book. I know technically Batman's not in it, but a million variations of him are, so I am counting it. And the third was Justice League number 50, where obviously Batman's part of a larger story. And yet, I would say Justice League number 50 is the strongest Batman story. I'll talk a little bit more about why, but the thing to take away from it for this review and Batman number 96 is Batman, these two books keep digging into like top shelf elements of Batman's past and feel like they're kind of running around in circles with Batman content. Either in Batman 96, just going back to his origins again, which feels exhausting. This book, which kind of does that too, but more accurately, it just it only really covers content we already kind of knew, and gives us very little others details beyond like a few things in the first story. Um, but Justice League number 50, I think, really is doing something different, and we'll talk about that. But it just highlights the importance of being different. This Tomasi book that's flashing by on my side of the screen right here is also really strong in this anthology issue because it was different. Everyone kind of, or well, no one really corrected me when I assumed Robin King was Damian Wayne in a bunch of videos, and I read that on websites. Everyone was kind of assuming that was going to be Damian Wayne, but instead we got like a completely different take on Bruce Wayne that I thought was cool. Like just a straight up sociopath from the beginning. And you know what? That story does revisit Batman's origins. I just happen to be on that page now that I'm thinking about it. But it does do it in a cool and different way. And it does put a twist on it I haven't seen before. So it can be done. But for the love of God, can we just stop for a while? There's so much more to Batman. Even this book at the beginning, like I said, digs into stuff that we don't see over and over again, even if it has been done before, like Batman training and becoming the Dark Knight, meeting new allies, stuff like that. There's room to explore. I mean, like I said, it's all been done before, but I don't feel exhausted talking about it or seeing that imagery here. Even when we went back to the content involving the first metal event, that felt fresh in here because it was neat to see it all again. And it's kind of good to have books like this summarize this. That might be the one way I do recommend this. If you think death metal is really cool and want to show it to someone, but know they'll have no idea what's going on, this is a great book for that. Even if I have some issues with it, I would recommend it for something like that. And I probably will, like now, because I've been sitting on my death metal issues, and I probably will until the event's done, so I have them for all the reviews. But I do want to share it with some friends. But now I have something to be like, read this first. And it will at least vaguely help them understand some of the stuff going on in death metal, even if they don't get all the little bits of it. Oh, also, something important out of this book that is worth mentioning that I forgot to touch on. Near the end of it, the first story, The Darkest Night does talk about very much being aware that Wally West has the powers of Dr. Manhattan, or like a variation of him, and wants to very much steal that power. But like that's kind of his last obstacle before he can go after Perpetua, and that's pretty interesting. I did mention I wasn't sure how they were going to go up against the Watchmen, or yeah, like a Watchmen empowered Batman who laughs. That might be it. It seems a little easy to me, and I think that might not be the case. But yeah, that's an interesting element that is dropped here. So there are little hints of what's to come, which is kind of cool, and it does help understand what the current mindset of this new character is. And he is a pretty cool character. I like the design of him, like just all black and creepy looking, and so powerful. DJ Tony Snark was saying, I've been enjoying Empire 150 times more than death metal. Kind of disappointed with death metal. Well, hey, you know what? That's an okay opinion to have. I don't begrudge you. I should say that because I'm gonna get even harsher with Empire when we talk about that book in a little bit. But a few people have been commenting that they happen to like Empire, and that's okay. Obviously, like I don't begrudge anyone for that or whatever. It's to each their own. I have trouble seeing what people are enjoying out of Empire, but I am enjoying certain tie-ins, and we're going to talk about a tie-in that I'm just loving this week as well. But I kind of feel the opposite. I understand kind of where people are coming from with Dark Knights. Like others, I don't see a lot of substance in this book, but I'm just enjoying the ride and all the different characters. But that's also kind of where I get a little disappointed with this book. This book should have been a fun exploration of those characters, and it was. I just wish there was a little more of some characters, and a couple of these stories were refined a little bit. Well, really, just the Manhattan story was refined a little bit. It could have been damn near perfect if they just rewrote one page. And that's so frustrating because you have like Tony S. Daniel doing really good artwork and really just drawing over this whole years long summary of Batman mythology that Snyder's been adding to the canon and doing a really good job with it. And then like adding new content to it once Batman becomes Manhattan and he starts flashing over all these other dark iterations of Batman we've never seen before that look very cool. There's like a Judge Dredd Batman, Caveman Batman, which we've kind of seen before, one empowered by Mr. Freeze technology, another with Bane tech, a Court of the Owls one that's clearly like went the path of Ra's al Ghul, and one that's got like Lex Luthor technology going for him. It's neat. It's so close to being like a solid book, and that's kind of what I'm worried about Death Metal is like it's really neat and it's got a lot of cool content. And like I said, what has been introduced is so interesting and has so much potential for just an idea going forward that I struggle to see it nosediving that much that I still wouldn't recommend and enjoy it. But I do get that there's but I do think like I do understand that like why people might not like it, but I'm just enjoying the ride. It's just so interesting and fun, and you know, I've said it before, but I don't think I'm that picky when it comes to certain superhero content. And so when something's not working for me, I really feel like it's just flailing around. But to be fair, people look for different things out of comics than I do and get different things out of stories and ideas. And I find I'm won over by the potential of an idea sometimes more than even the execution of it, which is in no small part why I'm enjoying Death Metal so much. Paddock was saying even the new Injustice Year Zero was a bit Batman focused. You know, I didn't get into Injustice Year Zero very much. Uh, but we'll see, like, what's his face? Tom Taylor's been teasing a lot of other crazy stuff with Injustice, and it seems more exciting to me. So we'll have to look into where all that goes. Paddock was saying even I prefer Dark Knights over, over Empire. Dark Knights is crazy, and I love it. Yeah, I applaud its ambition, and it really won me over in terms of that stuff. I agree that there could be more tie-ins for this. It's a weird thing to say because so many events and so many stories are so tie-in heavy, but I think DC could have pulled that off company-wide, to be honest, with this story. It's almost a shame that they didn't, but, you know, they don't need to do that all the time like Marvel does. And I'm very reluctant to advocate for that for any story, but that's how I feel. Like this one is almost worth doing. Maybe they felt it wasn't necessary because Metal had more scope to it and they didn't want to like hammer that home. And I applaud them for not being like for taking the less commercialized route for making a sequel to Metal. And that's kind of cool. Maybe they weren't sure it was going to be a commercial hit, which is funny because I'm sure it's a commercial hit. um, but you know, it's hard to read these things, and like I said earlier in this review, I don't always know what's going on the other side of things. People tend to make a lot of hay out of Diamond's numbers, but those numbers are becoming less and less relevant over time. Even before DC kind of stepped away from Diamond a little bit, there was always online sales, international markets, all these things that weren't necessarily factored into Diamond, and explained how sometimes Marvel or DC would continue a series that seemed like it was selling poorly in Diamond's direct market, or would cancel a series that seemed like it was doing relatively well, because I think there are numbers we don't necessarily see. Other people and those involved in the comic industries say that's not necessarily the case, but I get a lot of conflicting information about it. I think the truth is only the companies really know how much they sell, and it's not really ever fully published anywhere. But Whatever. Paddock was saying, I believe it's because of continuity in DC they didn't want to put in tie-ins so not to confuse readers. That's fine, because it is very unclear where all the canon is so far. And I get questions about that, and I don't really know. I think it kind of fits in better than people might suspect, just because it's like, well, this is all kind of clearly taking place on a side thing. But I digress. There's so many comics and stuff. Like, they should be able to do something substantive out of what they have. And if they don't, then yeah, then they really should have just published more books. I think, given the scope of this idea, it feels a lot bigger than Metal. I don't know why they didn't make it at least on par with that and have like a few more tie-ins planned or something. But there are some coming, and maybe we'll review them as they go along. Anyways, I think we'll leave things there. That felt like a pretty fun review. Next up, we've been dancing around it quite a bit, this review, so it's time to talk about Empire number 4. And I'm just going to say, issue 3, I was pretty down on things. This didn't reverse the trend much. We'll see. There's quite a bit to talk about, though, so I'll leave it at that. And stay tuned for it. It shouldn't... I'll figure out my schedule for the rest of the day, but we'll go from there. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time here on Comic Island. Bye now.